been sitting on this script for a while, and after watching They Cloned Tyrone back in July 2023, it became more important to me to dust off this script draft and look again into the world of pimp culture. But I kept getting sidetracked. The script re-entered my radar when news dropped about Sean Diddy Combs and ongoing rape and sex trafficking allegations. Now, it's finally time. While pimping is as old as sex work itself, the purpose of this episode of Let's Talk About Sex History will be to examine the unique relationship between pimping and Black Americans and the economically disenfranchised Black community. Pimping, which calls for violence, rape, manipulation, degradation, etc., came to be seen as a respectable way to fight the system and make something of oneself. The very meaning of pimping would come to be associated explicitly with Black men, thanks to urban literature, Blaxploitation films, and hip-hop. How has pimping culture affected Black sexual politics, society, and how we perceive sex trafficking? And like in every episode of this series, what do we have to gain from being honest about Black sexual history? Throughout the course of Let's Talk About Sex History, we've discussed the good, bad, and ugly of human sexuality, because the pursuit of pleasure should be a safe, happy, and consensual experience, and we make better choices when we're informed. This video is no different. Frequent viewers of my content know that this video's sponsor, Beducated, has over 100 courses on the pleasures of sex. But did you know that they also have a wealth of content on establishing boundaries, mental health, recovering from sexual trauma, destigmatizing STIs, and healing between partners? For people looking for inclusive lessons that can make you feel empowered and ready to explore your sexuality in the aftermath of harm, Beducated is a phenomenal tool. It's one thing to know positions and pleasure methods, but there's more to sex, like being a communicative and understanding partner. Beducated experts want to help. For the rest of October, Beducated is offering my subscribers 60% off the yearly pass. You can use my code ELEXIS60 to get that deal, including a 2-week money-back guarantee. But if you want to test it out first, Beducated also has a 24-hour free trial. Use the link in my description box to take advantage of this deal. Thank you so much to Beducated for continuing to prioritize safe and fun sex in a world that isn't always kind. Now, let's get into the history. If sex work is the world's oldest profession, pimping is the second oldest. In ancient Greece, the owners of pornai, or sex workers who usually had sex with many men in brothels or in the street, were called pornoboskos. The modern word pimp first appeared in a 1607 English play by Thomas Middleton called Your 5 Gallons, but it took a few centuries before it came to be the common word for procurer. In pre-modern Europe, many procurers prior to reforms were female madams in brothels, like Elizabeth Cresswell, one of the most renowned of the 17th century. She was a shrewd self-promoter, and her clients included the elite of London, all the way up to King Charles II himself. In numerous societies where sex workers have plied their trade, the fear of violence, law enforcement, or other factors, pimps offered protection in exchange for all, most, or a portion of the workers' money. Many pimps, like the pornoboskos, engaged in sex trafficking. The Catholic Church reported Nickie Roberts in Whores in History, dabbled in pimping and trafficking in the medieval era. In the case of fancy girls and fancy women, or enslaved women who were bought expressly for the purpose of sex, particularly in Louisiana, the procurers and pimps were enslavers, embodying the repulsive sex trafficking of antiquity and today, where there is no consent or autonomy. Aside from street walking and following encampments during the Civil War, the female procurer was the most prominent kind of sex working relationship in America before the 1920s, when progressive era legislation, moral panics, and the white slavery panic sent consensual sex work further underground. And as detailed by Nickie Roberts, the prohibition of alcohol and the resulting criminal organizations meant sex workers were extorted out of money by mobsters and pimps. As the criminalization of sex work became more formalized, the poor material conditions of survival sex workers fostered a dependence on pimps, particularly male ones. With the stigmatization of a prostitution arrest and the trauma and harm that comes from jail, Employment elsewhere becomes more and more unlikely with each arrest. A return to survival sex work and/or pimping becomes more and more likely. All the while, from the 1920s onward, the black male pimp held a special folk glory. This was the reality that spawned a distinct culture of pimping from the mid-20th century onward. The very first black pimp of note was a real man and folk hero named Stagger Lee, or Lee Shelton, a late 19th century resident of St. Louis. He was known to associate with a group of pimps called the Macs. Mac, or mackerel, had been a term for pimp as early as the late 19th century, abbreviated from the French word mackeral, meaning procurer. On Christmas 1895, Lee got into an argument with a man named William Lyons at a bar, who snatched the hat from Lee's head. According to the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, the latter indignantly demanded its return. Lyons refused, and Sheldon withdrew his revolver and shot Lyons in the abdomen. When his victim fell to the floor, Sheldon took his hat from the hand of the wounded man and coolly walked away. He was subsequently arrested and locked up at the Chestnut Street station. Lee went to jail, was eventually released, likely thanks to political influence he swayed, and would die in 1912. Over 60 recordings detailed and mythicized Stagger Lee and his cold and calm demeanor, as well as plays and stories. But a more infamous pimp was on the way. In 1918, Robert Lee Maupin was born in Chicago, Illinois. It's important to note that by this time, various ethnic groups had dabbled in sex commerce, including Italians and Poles, but also the Chinese, who trafficked women in California and the Pacific Northwest and managed to turn the trade into profitable and legal dry cleaners, restaurants, and more. The black Chicago sex trade, up until this point, was documented in Cynthia M Blair's I've Got to Make My Living. And a crucial part of the industry was the red light district known as the Levee, which operated from 1880 to 1912 and was similar to New Orleans' Storyville. Blair wrote, "Men's control of women's work pace, earnings, and bodies did not emerge as an endemic feature of urban prostitution until after 1920. As nightclubs and saloons grew in Chicago's Black Belt after 1900, more pimps popped up." Dr. Blair also noted that when black men were brought into court in the 1910s for pimping or pandering, it usually had something to do with white women. For instance, famous boxer and Chicago resident Jack Johnson was arrested twice for so-called pimping and trafficking under the Mann Act for traveling with his white girlfriend, an ex-sex worker named Lucille Cameron. So if a black man was seen with a white woman in the early 20th century, it was usually assumed that he was pimping her. This was the Chicago that Robert Maupin was born into, and where he would spend parts of his childhood. At the age of 3, he was sexually abused for the first time by a babysitter. And after enjoying the guidance of a stepfather, he resented his mother when she left him and thus severed the relationship. Robert hated his mother and fantasized about beating her. As a teen, Robert would see pimps bring their women into his mother's hair shop, and he was enchanted by the control they exerted and their lifestyles. Later, in his best-selling memoir, Robert Iceberg Slim Beck would write how an older pimp named Sweet Jones told him when he was 18 and entering the Milwaukee game, "Slim, a pimp is really a whore who has reversed the game on whores." Pimp, the story of my life, written with the help of his white wife Betty Shue in the wake of the civil rights and black power movements, detailed Beck's rise in Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, and his fall. Over 2 million copies were sold between 1967 and 1973 in liquor stores, barbershops, and on street tables. The book also got passed around in prisons, which is where a young Donald Goines, struggling with heroin addiction in Michigan's Jackson Penitentiary, first read it. Though he grew up with middle-class black parents, Goines ran the streets after being discharged from the military in the 50s, and one of his many illicit occupations was pimping. After reading Beck's memoir, Goines was inspired and began writing fiction, 16 novels laced with pimps, pushers, cops, and criminals, before his murder in 1974. Whoreson, the story of a ghetto pimp, was the gritty tale of a boy born to a sex worker who inevitably becomes a pimp. Robert Beck's autobiography had ripple effects on a number of hip-hop figures and pimps, specifically with its influence in the Blaxploitation craze just a few years later. Take Robert Poole, a Bay Area Mac who began writing a screenplay about his life while in jail after reading Pimp. His screenplay was allegedly written on toilet paper and would be The Mac, starring Max Julien and Richard Pryor. The film explores the life of a pimp named Goldie, whose brother is a black nationalist. But we'll be back to Blaxploitation in a bit. Another early pimp of note was Malcolm X in 1920s Harlem. He explained the game in his autobiography thusly. Most men, the prostitutes felt, were too easy to push around. The prostitutes said that most men needed to know what the pimps knew. A woman should occasionally be babied enough to show her the man had affection, but beyond that, she should be treated firmly. These tough women said that it worked with them. All women, by their nature, are fragile and weak. They are attracted to the male in whom they see strength. Nearly all pimp literature is adamant about the special brand of masculinity exhibited by the stereotypical pimp. In stark opposition to the patriarchal standard that men take care of their woman and family, the pimp's masculinity rests on extracting resources from women to fund their lifestyles. The women, hardened by street life and abuse, wouldn't fold to a weak man. The goal was to penetrate a woman's mind and instill your principles and protocols so she performed without question or thought, something that took finesse and not always pure physical abuse. A woman's devotion was and is the pimp's ultimate display of success. While female procurers had been common before, after the 1920s, the few that popped up earned notoriety. Take Odessa Madre. She was a graduate of Washington's Dunbar High School, saying in a 1980 interview, "There was only 3 blacks at Dunbar back then. I mean black like me. I had good diction, I knew the gestures, but they always made fun of me." She skipped college to run the streets, and many of her friends were Irish cops and criminals she had grown up with in the mixed neighborhood of Cowtown. She was noted for being lesbian, and her designation of pimp instead of madam stemmed from her masculinity. She'd arrive at her nightclub, Club Madre, surrounded by her stable, and she allegedly had a relationship with the performer, Moms Mabley. Madre explained, "I didn't set out to get into the trick trade, but I had come to know so many white fellows. And you know how they are. They love some colored gals. So I pay a girl $25 and tell her to be at such and such a place at a certain time, and hell, we'd both make out like fat rats." The pimping lifestyle allowed her entrance into circles of society she wouldn't otherwise be allowed, saying, "If you got a wad, honey, they'll suck up to you like you was a Tootsie Roll." This power and respect, granted by financial success and effective pimping, would continue to be coveted as the role evolved and was dramatized on film. Iceberg Slim would move on to write a series of other books, including essays and novels, as well as hitting the college lecture circuit as a public intellectual and attending Black Panther meetings. His 1967 novel, Trick Baby, was turned into a 1972 Blaxploitation film, but it was severely diluted. His thoughtful tale about a drag queen in Chicago in 1969's Mama Black Widow, and his 1971 book of political essays and revolutionary rhetoric, The Naked Soul of Iceberg, were both overlooked. Additionally, Iceberg Slim's original message disparaging his former occupation as pimp was lost in the heady Blaxploitation of the era. Think Supa Fly, The Mac, Dolomite, and Willie Dynamite. In Willie Dynamite, the pimp compares himself to any other titan of American industry, saying, 7 girls out there. Every 10 minutes, one comes off the production line, like that. This is a business, baby, a production line. And just like GM, Ford, Chrysler, Willie's coming through. But like so many other films where easy money was explored, the fall was swift. By the way, can we just get some love for the beautiful Joyce Walker who starred in Willie Dynamite? Like, this video had me enchanted. She's gorgeous. Look at her. Beautiful. In 1974's Truck Turner, Isaac Hayes hunts down a pimp named Gator, who relies on the help of a madam played by Nichelle Nichols in her only Blaxploitation role.
Mama, you ain't gonna keep this shit together with Gator gone.
Come here, you little black bitch. That your ass belongs to me. I tell you what you can and can't do with it. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I didn't say I was leaving.
Shut up! Now all you whores sit down, I want to talk to you. Anybody thinking about leaving here is gonna find my left foot square up their ass. Do you understand it?
Why?
Shut up, you junkie whore!
When the movie was shown in theaters, it was a double feature with Foxy Brown, depicting Pam Grier in the titular role going undercover as a sex worker and busting a sex trafficking ring. Both films were written by white people. Did you know that the pimp sport in the 1976 film Taxi Driver was originally black? Quentin Tarantino insisted that Columbia Pictures should have never switched the race of the pimp in Taxi Driver from black to white as it was originally written, because he thought it would be more impactful that way. In a November 1977 issue of Ebony, a psychologist explained the many ways men pimp their women. It discussed different forms of emotional abuse, forced submission in relationships, as well as different types of misogynists. So pimping terminology was entering the mainstream, and the clothes worn in Blaxploitation films were very fashionable for regular people. The aesthetics in films were one thing, but the subculture was explored deeply in 1973's Black Players, The Secret World of Black Pimps, a study by social anthropologists Richard and Christina Milner, featuring over 148 hours of taped interviews. The study grew from the fact that while in graduate school, Christina, a white woman, started stripping to support her and her husband Richard. Coincidentally, an origin story that earned Richard respect from the pimps they interviewed because they thought he was pimping his old lady. Christina's stage name was Tiger Red. They mentioned that obviously not all pimps in the world are black. The majority are undoubtedly white, but we have attempted to describe only the particular scene we fell into. For 6 months, the couple immersed themselves into the Bay Area, earning the trust of sex workers and pimps. They gathered their research at bars, restaurants where pimps and hoes gather after work, jam houses, private fried chicken parties in homes attended by 20 to 30 people, and public parties advertised, sometimes over the radio on a soul station, as Players Night and held at large nightclubs, among other venues in Oakland and San Francisco. If I quoted all of the interesting things in this book, we'd be here all day. But it's an eye-opening, though dated read on Bay Area pimp culture in the early 70s. The methods of pimps breaking in new women was discussed, as well as the pimp creed of not doing anything unless being paid, which was often repeated. Though interestingly, the pimps interviewed were never paid. The book also ended stereotypes about pimps and made it easier to see how they really operated. A key conclusion by the anthropologist was that the elaborate subculture was because black pimps feel they have to regain their manhood, which has been lost to whitey and to women. The Macs in the interviews were adamant about not being pimped themselves. Explain the Milners. All of us at some time either are exploited or we exploit. This is something the players know, and their honesty is admirable. A pimp's desire is to never be a trick. Of course, that's impossible because everybody has a trick side. That in itself is a topic of pimp humor. Think back to the advice Robert Beck got from a mentor. Out pimping somebody, or life, before it pimps you. Wrote the Milners. Every American major institution, from the law courts and the business establishment to the armed services, is viewed by the players as a pimping situation. They see society itself as a network of people gaming off each other for money, power, or some kind of ego gratification. The preacher is a pimp gaming off his congregation. The politician is a pimp gaming off his constituents. The wife is a hoe gaming off her husband, who is her trick. The whites pimp the blacks, and the federal government pimps everybody. The view, widely held throughout the ghetto, has recently found expression in the writings of black militants and is one of the few areas in which pimps and panthers seem to be in perfect agreement. Remember the era that this was in. This was during the Vietnam War, civil rights and black power movements, so of course the idea of the government pimping out the little man, especially black people, was potent.
You mean it's like this here? Let me see, so you ever really want to have to cut a bitch? I mean, sometimes you want a bitch to think you might, but shit.
So Nick's and Pimp. Well, shit. Yeah. That makes good sense to me.
Of course, I was in the shit for a year. You know that, right? A Mackeral division. They had me up in them Central Highlands. Yeah. Nixon know what he doing in Vietnam, bro. He know the game.
Interestingly, Richard, who was allegedly kicked out of his doctoral program because of the study, said in 1973, "In the university, it is increasingly clear to me that professors are pimping the students." Through this lens, it makes perfect sense why the pimp would take on legend-like qualities in a similar vein as drug dealers, despite the human toll. The flamboyant subculture of pimping that existed in the black community and that was being depicted in pop culture obscured the fact that pimping was happening in more locations than the hood, and not just by black men. TV show host and actor James Lipton revealed that he was a pimp in Paris in the 1950s. At the storied Chicken Ranch in La Grange, Texas, the exploits of female madams since 1917 was romanticized and gussied up for the musical and movie The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, the latter of which starred Dolly Parton and Burt Reynolds. On porn sets, the controlling white pimp boyfriend was best exemplified by Linda Borman, whose abusive husband Chuck Traynor forced her to perform as Linda Lovelace in Deep Throat, along with pimping her out. As for Hugh Hefner, whose complex Playboy legacy I will explore in a future video about the good, the bad, and the ugly, he was praised as the most iconic pimp for his carefully crafted image of being surrounded by white women and using their bodies to build his fortune. And recent revelations about life in the Playboy Mansion have alleged that this came with mental abuse, drugs, and typical tactics employed by pimps. And as for fictional white pimps, there were Tom Cruise and his competitor in 1983's Risky Business, and a slew of Eastern European pimp characters. Still, when you ask somebody to imagine a pimp, a certain image comes to mind. Think of Huggy Bear, the jive-talking pimp on popular action series Starsky and Hutch. When the 70s were over, that image of the Mac was elevated further in hip-hop by artists who were inspired by the pimp writings and blaxploitation films they grew up on. And as the films and fashion raged, Robert Iceberg Slim Beck fell back from his revolutionary rhetoric in favor of stylizing himself as a pimp again, detailed by Robin D.G. Kelly in the essay The Fires That Forged Iceberg Slim. The rapper and actor Ice-T, born Tracey Lauren Marrow, claimed to dabble in pimping in the 1980s when living in Hawaii. Part of his inspiration stemmed from a pimp he met there, as well as his lifelong obsession with Pimp by Iceberg Slim. He'd tell Esquire, "The lingo, the depth of the streets, the way Slim talked, it was totally fascinating. And before you know it, I was a 16-year-old kid talking to girls like a 50-year-old man." Why does my Ice-T kind of sound accurate? Hold on, I'm sorry. But, he elaborated, "You are not a professional at something unless you pay your rent doing it. I never made enough money to pay my rent." So he was a bad pimp, but a pimp nonetheless. He would eventually use his exploitation money to buy turntables and begin making music. He'd later say that pimping would prepare him for his career in Hollywood, saying, "I can't act, I really can't act. I ain't no rapper, it's all game. I'm just working these niggas." I'm glad he admitted he can't act, because it's true. But shout out to Law & Order SVU though. Todd Anthony Shaw, the son of two college-educated accountants who moved from LA to Oakland, was influenced by the Mac movie when he began his rap career as Too Short in the 1980s. Noted for being one of the first rappers to use the word bitch in his music, his 1987 album Born to Mac sold over 500,000 copies without distribution. Too Short was allegedly never a pimp, but made the culture a central theme of his work. But that's not to say his pimp sensibilities didn't blend into his real life. In addition to lending his expertise as a pimpology expert in a glorifying documentary, in 2012 through XXL magazine, he told a group of middle schoolers how to turn little girls out. XXL came under fire for the videos, which have since been taken down, but recounted Deneen Miller. In one, he encourages middle school boys to push middle school girls up against walls and push their spit-covered fingers into their vaginas. And in a second, he schools boys on how to convince girls to give up their lunch and money to boys. This was the editor, Vanessa Satin, who let that shit slide. Too Short only realized the error of what he was saying after, quote, "I talked to some very responsible females, some very important females." The same year as Too Short's Born to Mac album, the film Street Smart premiered. Starring Christopher Reeve and Morgan Freeman, a reporter makes up a pimp named Tyrone, while a real ruthless pimp with a similar story gains notoriety. Divulged The New Yorker, that's what the screenwriter, David Freeman, did when he published The Lifestyle of a Pimp in New York Magazine in May 1969. It created no big stir, there were no dire results, and no big-time benefits either. Like the protagonist of the film, David Freeman made up everything for that article. The persona and point of view of pimps would be used by various rappers from Ice Cube to Dr. Dre to Snoop Dogg. And in 1992, Robert Beck died with little fanfare or much money to his name, wrote Justin Gifford in Street Poison, the biography of Iceberg Slim. America's most famous pimp was seemingly being pimped by the commercial literary marketplace that had made him a star. He documented how his publishing company, Holloway House, capitalized on black writers by becoming the self-proclaimed world's largest publisher of black experience paperback books. Holloway House published over 400 such tomes, pimping the authors, including Robert Beck, out of most of their royalties. Holloway House also created Players magazine in 1973 to capitalize on the pimp craze, and it championed itself as the black Playboy by publishing erotica, softcore nudes, and shallow ghetto life material, but nothing about black history or intellectualism. It served as a vehicle for advertising Holloway House's urban literature titles and made its white founders wealthy. Enter the Hughes brothers, directors of Menace to Society and Dead Presidents, who wanted to turn Pimp by Iceberg Slim into a movie, but missed out on the film rights. Instead, they created 1999's American Pimp on a budget of less than $1 million, filming and interviewing by themselves. In addition to interviews with illegal pimps, the directors profiled Hugh Hefner and Dennis Hoff, owner of the Bunny Ranch in Nevada and future husband of Heidi Fleiss, a former Hollywood madam we discuss more in Lectual Does the 90s. Hoff started the Moonlight Bunny Ranch in '92. The Hughes brothers were reported to have been filming American Pimp back in 1997, and HBO then decided to churn out Pimps Up, Hoes Down a year before the twins debuted their documentary at Sundance to compete. It's a great training aid for new detectives, said a Las Vegas cop on Pimps Up, Hoes Down. But there was controversy over the paid interviews. Dish Entertainment Weekly in '98, a behind-the-scenes tactic is causing controversy among veteran documentarians. HBO paid pimps between $500 and $700 per day for their participation, while $4,000 went to 3 pimps for permission to film the Players Ball, an underground annual award show. This impacted production for the Hughes brothers. Added Entertainment Weekly, the Hughes brothers also paid pimps for their self-financed project and planned to include a disclaimer, but only after HBO opened the floodgates. Everybody was interested in pimps in the late 90s. News articles followed. Ira Glass hosted 3 pimps from the 1970s on This American Life in '99. And rapped Ice-T in that year's Always Wanted to Be a Hoe. Are you my pimp? Oh dear God, don't say that. I'm your manager, your boyfriend, your agent, your Mac. Now I'ma do my hair, baby. I'll be right back. And how old are you? 16? Well, that's just right. But you're 18 if anybody asks tonight. There are an abundance of these types of lyrics told in narrative rap form, but also melding with rappers' personas, making it hard to distinguish what was real and what was just a marketing tactic or a storytelling technique. Pimping would have an additional renaissance in the early 2000s in various real sex exposés on HBO that exposed the gritty underbelly of street-based sex work and, by extension, exploitation. Much of what the Milners had uncovered in the seedy underbelly of the 70s Bay Area had remained intact. One of the Macs in American Pimp, named Rosebud, even got a book deal teaching how to pimp and a smattering of generally good press, while he admitted to violence and literal trafficking. A 2000 documentary called Pimp Snooki explored the life of Derek Avery, a Milwaukee, Wisconsin-based pimp who embodied the extensive world of sex trafficking in the Midwest. He had also been featured in American Pimp and Pimps Up, Hoes Down, as well as an episode of The Jerry Springer Show.
Damn, she don't sit there and look at me and wave at me. Motherfucker, hoe, acknowledge me. Come here. Come here. Come on. You do what the fuck I tell you to do. You understand that?
When he was finally arrested and eventually sentenced to 20 years in 2012, it was revealed that Pimp Snooki controlled his women by beating them with his fists, wooden and metal brooms, pool cues, pans, chairs, and leather belts, slapping them in the face methodically back and forth with his rings facing inward, stomping and kicking them with his alligator shoes, and placing a phone book on their backs and striking it with a baseball bat. Snooki would claim that all of his appearances in these documentaries was an act. Meanwhile, in urban literature books, the low self-esteem black girl obsessed with materialism and or being loved by a dangerous man was hardened into an archetype, warning of the dangers of being turned out. And as I explored in my video on urban literature, these messages of warning weren't always received the way they should have been by the intended audience. When I was a youth in the 2000s, there was a recurring character on the scene of award shows, music videos, parties, and random VH1 TV specials that led me to ask the question, who the fuck is Bishop Don Magic Juan? He was always accompanying rappers, grinning, and otherwise appearing affable. But in reality, Bishop Don Magic Juan had been a vicious pimp who found God in 1985 while high on PCP and watching a televangelist broadcast. Real name Donald Campbell. His life echoed so many who eventually got into pimping. Not only was he born to a pimp in Chicago, but he was raped multiple times by older women from ages 5 to 13. He also grew up poor and desired to emulate the life of Iceberg Slim after reading his memoir. Like so many others who failed to see Slim's warning, the flashy lifestyle attracted him. He would later say, I considered the pimp game a great trade because I didn't like going to jail. I'd rather send someone else in my place. And that's an important quote because for most of sex history, women, not the Johns or the pimps, were the ones to get in trouble. They were the ones often going to jail, not Johns or pimps. Don Magic Juan quickly amassed a fortune and kept his stable of exploited women in line with a hanger, whip, or pin stick, and would even go a step further to pour alcohol or rub salt onto their wounds. Bishop Don Magic Juan's 1974 birthday party would become an annual event known as the Players Ball for Milwaukee and Chicago traffickers. He bragged about his utter control thusly. A girl got shot 5 times. I get to the scene and the girl says, Daddy, I want to get up from here so I can go get your money. Her mama said, what have you done to my daughter? I didn't do nothing. That's dedication. After his 1985 revelation, Don Magic Juan became ordained as a minister and opened a church, which is totally perfect for a pimp to become a pastor or a pastor to become a pimp. They're so closely related, my God. Anyways, he made a series of talk show appearances, including on Jerry Springer, before it became, well, you know, Jerry. Of course, Jerry's show, which we discussed in Lectual Does the 90s, episode 6, would find higher ratings in sex workers, pimps, and other scorned members of society. Are you learning something new from this video on the pimp and black culture? Don't forget to check out this video's sponsor, Beducated. For the rest of October, Beducated is offering my subscribers 60% off the yearly pass, giving you access to courses on healing, destigmatization, and communication from leading experts. You can use my code ELEXIS60 at the link in my description box to get this amazing deal. Don Magic Juan published a memoir, From the Pimp Stick to Pulpit, in 1994 with his sister Anne Bromfield. He made TV commercials, which I'd love to include, but can't because of his music selection. He said on his sister's participation in the memoir, she'd been making notes for the book since 1972. She'd be watching and then she'd have to run home and write it all down. It was hard on her, but she did a good job. The language isn't as harsh as in the Iceberg Slim books, but it's straightforward. He compared pimping to being a pastor, what I tell you, telling the Chicago reader, you talk to people. I talk to all kinds of people. Many of the same people I talked to when I was a pimp. I evangelize. I go to jails and high schools. I talk to gangs and girls and I tell them things can change. I talk about safe sex, tell them to use condoms. We have the highest incidence of AIDS in Chicago in my neighborhood on the west side. I give condoms to the girls. Somehow this doesn't make me feel good. Like, I don't know who he was trying to impress, saying he was giving teen girls condoms, but okay, sure, whatever. For the next decade, his grift as religious reformed pimp who still glamorized the pimp aesthetic would pay off. After wrecking countless lives, assaulting countless women, and never making restitution, this is the man who was touted by rappers, became the spiritual advisor of actors like Gina Gershon, and was peppered into the absurd zeitgeist of the 2000s. He told the LA Times in 2003, it's a fantastic time to be an ex-pimp. Once to be a pimp was a bad thing. It was like a cuss word. But now it's something that everybody is trying to be. He thrived in the era of the sanitization of the pimp for harmless and/or inoffensive consumption. In 2000, the same year that Pimp, The Story of My Life reached a total of $5 million in sales, Tariq Nasheed published The Art of Mackin', describing it as the first book that teaches men how to become players and macs and how to use the pimp game to get what they want from women. Teaching how to pimp or have the Mac mindset would make plenty of pickup artist instructors like Nasheed a pretty penny. So while back in the 70s, Ebony magazine was trying to get men to break away from pimping and romantic relationships, in the new millennium, pickup artist instructors like Nasheed were responding to third wave feminism, gold digging, and a self-esteem crisis in disenfranchised men by encouraging them to Mac and game their conquests. Did he put that in Hidden Colors? Was he talking about how he was encouraging black men to pimp women? Or anyways, in music, there was Got Your Money by Old Dirty Bastard and Khalees, Big Pimpin' by Jay Z and UGK, Pimp by 50 Cent and Snoop Dogg, and Pimpin' All Over the World by Ludacris and Bobby Valentino. On TV, there was the outrageous and often fake Pimp My Ride. Websites covered pimps and hoes balls in various cities, and college fraternities continued the tradition of costumed pimps and hoes parties. There were pimp cups, pimp costumes, and even a pimp on the 2001 King of the Hill episode, Ho Yeah.
Man, this feels a little light. You jacking me?
I am the Mac Daddy of Heimlich County. I play it straight up, yo. You get the hell out of my hood. She's my hoe now.
All right, man, you can have her.
Snoop Dogg, who voiced the character of Alabaster from Oklahoma, infused his personal brand with the pimp persona and lifestyle. The year of that King of the Hill episode, his 2001 porn film, Doggy Style, a collaboration with Larry Flynt and Hustler, was the best-selling adult release of the year. Other pimp-oriented rappers would follow, like Ice-T and Lil Jon, none of them participating as anything more than hosts of the hedonism. Noted Dr. Muriel Miller-Young in A Taste for Brown Sugar, the rappers perform as pimps who oversee the interaction between sex workers, their hoes, and black male porn actors. Therefore, the rappers in hip-hop porn also objectify the bodies of black men in their self-representations of black masculine authority. In 2003, Snoop topped himself by arriving to a red carpet with two alleged sex workers. He said to the Associated Press, "It's cool to look good. It's cool to have girls on your arm and get money from them. And that's a good feeling, you dig? There ain't nothing wrong with it." A 2006 article by Torre for Rolling Stone titled "Snoop Dogg, America's Most Lovable Pimp," dug deeper. Said Snoop, "I was flexing my pimp muscle and letting people see how real pimps do it. If you really a pimp, you should be able to get two bitches to walk on a leash with you down the red carpet and be your hoes for the night. And when I did it, it really was pimping." He bragged about his pimping tutelage from the actor Max Julien, who played Goldie in The Mac, and reminisced on dressing like pimps with a friend in the 10th and 11th grade for a school contest and winning back-to-back. He said his wife Shantae, whose father was a pimp, allowed his pimping because she knew it was his childhood dream to be one. He continued to act out his fantasy by portraying Huggy Bear in the 2004 Starsky and Hutch remake. Snoop credited pimping with helping him turn from gangbanging and violence at the end of the 90s after his murder trial, telling Torre, "I made sure my bitch would never talk shit to me. She always got all the money up front. She never looked in another pimp's eyes. She kept her head down. But I wasn't a gorilla pimp where I was beating the girls up. I was more finesse with it, just giving you a comfort zone and providing you with opportunity. Cause I know so many motherfuckers who like buying it. So if you come fuck with me, it's not as much of a risk as being with a gorilla pimp." This lifestyle led to an estranged marriage with Shantae, and Snoop filed for divorce in 2004. And often this is missing from recent viral postings about how long the couple have been married. Other pimps convinced Snoop to give up the lifestyle and go back home. Please listen to this quote and tell me what it sounds like to you. "Before, I would never listen to her. Everything I say is law. But on the comeback, I'm more of an ear instead of a mouth, instead of a hand. Sometimes it irritates me to hear her talk shit to me, but when it's right, that's the way it's supposed to feel." A hand. A hand. One of his best buddies is Dr. Dre. The 2000s were really a different time. Like, I cannot imagine any celebrity today coming online or being in an interview talking about how they were pimping girls and alluding to abuse in their marriages. In the wake of gigantic events featuring P. Diddy and Jeff Epstein in the modern times, these quotes by Snoop Dogg and his lack of remorse or apology is extremely telling. Were any of the women he pimped out able to walk away with their reputations similarly unscathed? And if asked about his comments today as one of America's most beloved celebrities, like for real, people love Snoop, what would he say? Would he apologize? Would he say he's changed? Would he accept accountability? I wonder. But back to the early 2000s. In 2004, when a spokesman for an online costume retailer was under fire for selling children's pimps and hoes costumes, he said, "We started with the pimp suit 2 years ago. It's one of our biggest sellers. We also sell pimp and hoe outfits to whole families, mom, dad, kids, and the dog." That same year, residents of the Chicago suburb of Maywood, where the 30th annual Players Ball took place, protested unsuccessfully to stop the event. 2005's Lil Pimp, featuring a 9-year-old pimp and characters voiced by Bernie Mac, Lil Kim, and Ludacris, wasn't well received. Said Chris Rock, "That's where I draw the line. That's where I get corny. My daughter will not be at the Kid Pimp movie. I want to meet the white executive who said yes, Lil Pimp." Also in 2005, the third episode of The Boondocks, entitled "Guess Who's Coming to Dinner," featured Granddad falling in love with a sex worker whose pimp, played by Katt Williams, comes knocking.
Crystal, who is this person?
Nigga, are you deaf? I'm a pimp named Slickback. Say it with me now.
He's my pimp.
Your pimp? So you really are
Yes, she's a hoe. Come on, bitch.
Pimping was a central theme of Katt Williams' stand-up movie and TV career, stretching back to his 2002 appearance as Money Mike in Friday After Next. The pimp continued to dominate in the mid-2000s. The 2005 movie Hustle and Flow garnered 3-6 Mafia an Oscar for the song "It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp," fictionally created by Terrence Howard's character.
We do what the fuck we gotta do, man. By any means. Ain't that right? We take care of our shit. You think I like this shit? You think I want to spend the rest of my life pimping your pimple country ass? Well, not me. Fucking hate you. I hate this shit.
D! Do you know what I do in the back of them cars? Do you? Everybody's got something to do. Everybody's got something important going on in their life but me, D.
When it won an Oscar in 2006, complained Cortland Malloy, "Hustle and Flow. Of course, songs and stories about black pimps are nothing new, but never before has the degradation of black women at the hands of stereotypically thuggish black men been so deeply ingrained in popular culture." Also in 2006, the 6th annual Pimps and Hoes gathering of Chicago, a costume party that attracted 1,200 guests to Transit nightclub the previous year, and which was a commercialized ripoff of Don Magic Juan's party, was protested by the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. Said a former trafficking victim to the Chicago Tribune, "It's belittling because I'll bet if you went up to one of those young people and asked, they tell you they don't want a hoe anywhere near their street corner. But for fun, they want to embrace that and portray that image without even understanding the pain that these women go through or the horrible things pimps do to them." The same month as that Pimps and Hoes party, Chicago Magazine published an expose on a dentist named Gary S. Kimmel, who laundered the money of 3 pimps and their victims in an underage sex trafficking ring. Documented the Chicago Sun-Times, he fixed a prostitute's teeth and then had her perform 2 hours of sexual favors for a friend, according to court papers. Court records also show that one of the prostitutes Kimmel did work on at the request of a pimp was a minor girl. But stories like these couldn't compete with the sanitization of pimp culture. It was both a continued trend of ignoring the mistreatment of women deemed inferior, but also an example of the way slang forms and words change. While there were blatant examples of pimping culture being appropriated and made glamorous or comical, like the documentaries and Pimps and Hoes parties, it was also stripped of its context and made into a lingo. What's up, pimpin'? That's pimpin'. To make money, you need to pimp the system. To gussy something up or make it fancy was called pimping it. Said Too Short in 2000 on the sudden rise of pimping to mean cool or to be a type of labor. They liked the way it sounds. I'm a pimp, I'm a Mac. Nobody's actually saying I'm a pimp and attempting to prostitute women. Perhaps nobody tried to change the meaning of the word pimp more than the rapper Nelly, who tried to redefine it as an acronym for positive, intellectual, motivated person. Per his 2002 song Pimp Juice. Now your pimp juice is anything attract the opposite sex. It could be money, fame, or straight intellect. Bitches got the pimp juice too. Come to think about it, dirty, they got more than we do. Nelly created a college scholarship with the name PIMP Juice Scholarship in collaboration with his Pimp Juice Premium Energy Drink. And how many of you remembered that Nelly had an energy drink named Pimp Juice? $5,000 apiece was given to 2 winners who wrote essays explaining why he or she is a pimp. Wrote Dawn Turner Trice for the Chicago Tribune. Unfortunately, this is simply a cheap way to curry favor in the black community, and a veiled attempt to market some juice. Added Michelle Singletary, pass by this scholarship. The word pimping also has a surprising history in the medical profession. A 1989 article popularized the term pimping, linking it with a 19th century practice of teaching medicine. Afterward, in some medical schools, the practice of asking students on-the-spot questions to test their knowledge became known as pimping. Recent scholarship has pointed out how this gendered word reflects the gender bias and inequities in the world of medical education, as well as questioning the authenticity of the 1989 article. When the Hughes brothers were filming American Pimp in 1997, Albert, who has been living in the Czech Republic since 2004, and that's not weird or suspicious in any way, he asserted, "What our film will make you understand is that the pimp and the prostitute really need each other. The feminists like downing the pimps, but they really need each other. The prostitute is the only kind of woman that a pimp will associate with, and a pimp is the only type of man that a prostitute doesn't see as a trick. Instead, he's a real man that she's in a relationship with, someone that she can even be in love with." What's he doing out there in the Czech Republic? Anyways, 16 years later after that quote, the way people viewed and discussed pimping was changing. In 2013, it was reported that a 45-year-old father and his 22-year-old son were arrested for a long-term trafficking operation in Milwaukee. From jail, King David Moore instructed his son Najee, telling him to find a white victim and providing advice to keep his prostitutes moving from town to town. Always bond most with the one who earns him the most money, not the one he likes the most, and that having one prostitute is close to having no prostitute. Ice-T, in the midst of a decade-long stint as a sex crimes cop on Law & Order SVU, along with his manager Jorge, produced 2013's Iceberg Slim, Portrait of a Pimp. When asked if the documentary was glorifying Iceberg Slim, Tracey said, "That's what this story is about. It's about a guy who thought this was a cool thing, a method to get paid. But then he has that revelation. Pimping is for young guys and suckers who don't know. He comes out and tries to live a square life." In the same interview for Esquire, Ice-T would discuss the death of the pimp, saying, "Because of the internet, women don't need nobody. Yeah, it's a sad thing, but pimps are becoming ancient history." I don't think that's sad, but as the term pimp became a colloquialism, anybody attempting to get ahead in an exploitative system can be one. When pimping is used, for instance, by female rappers, it doesn't mean sex trafficking, but to control men before they control you, similar to pimping the system. And thus we have seen a divergence between the pimp identity, the pimp aesthetic, and the pimp mindset, which is really just capitalism with a fur coat and cane. Meanwhile, Albert Hughes' 1997 assertion that sex workers need pimps wouldn't hold up. Why? As more women moved to online sex work and had the availability to screen clients themselves, there became less need for a pimp. In 2014, researchers from Baylor University found that in cities where Craigslist's erotic services section was rolled out, the female homicide rate dropped by anywhere from 1% to 17.6%. With sites like Backpage and Craigslist, more women kept money for themselves, set their own fees, and used digital security tools like client verification and bad date lists of dangerous men to screen for safety. But still, plenty of women would voluntarily link with pimps and would willingly put other women in danger.
You want to hear a story about how me and this bitch here fell out?
It's kind of long, but it's full of suspense. I'm the real Zola, and this is my new book, The Story, also known as The Thodacy.
In 2015, Asia Zola King tweeted an iconic 148-tweet thread diving into a weekend trip gone extremely wrong, featuring a white sex worker named Jessica and a Nigerian pimp. According to Asia, Jessica set her up. She'd say, what Jessica was experiencing was not sex trafficking. What she was experiencing was sex work. She was confident. She liked doing what she was doing. She was aware. She gave her consent. I did not. So I was in a sex trafficking situation while she's sitting right next to me, but she's in a sex work situation. So at that point, I just had to figure it the fuck out. The pimp that Zola described was not a cutesy Snoop Dogg securing brand deals and making weed with Martha Stewart type. He was a terrifying murderer, rapist, and trafficker. In the film, the character, played by Coleman Domingo, was cleaned up to be less scary, though there were still moments that showed he was not a nice guy. Zola's thread and eventual movie was on the cusp of a new era of the pimp. Me Too. While the righteous backlash to sex trafficking and rape culture has grown, some say there's a difference between pimping and outright sex trafficking. Hollywood titans like Harvey Weinstein were under new examination for their behavior behind the scenes, and rape culture was being treated more seriously. Jeffrey Epstein was exposed for international sex trafficking of minors, making something like an International Pimp of the Year title a bit less appealing to the mainstream. The fabled pimps of the 1970s were expertly explored in fiction like HBO's The Deuce in 2017. In one amazing storyline, a sex worker tells her pimp who has lost control of her that they were both playing a role. He subsequently takes up acting as the streets of Times Square are squeezed of the sex trade, signaling a fall in the prestige of the pimp. Don Magic Juan, meanwhile, has continued having players' balls, but they noticeably are filled with older and older faces, and they aren't covered nearly with as much positivity as they were in the early 2000s. Still, a shiny kind of pimp, allegedly like Taz of the notorious Taz's Angels, exists on corners of the internet. Think of Andrew Tate, the notorious alleged sex trafficker and proven misogynist who would continue to inspire manosphere spaces for utilizing longtime pimp rhetoric. But men aren't the only ones. In 2019, an infamous 23-year-old LA-based social media user named Melanie Williams, aka The Pretty Hoe, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for sex trafficking. In the years prior to her arrest, she went viral for her abuse, antics, and drama, cultivating a small following who kept up with her on Snapchat and Twitter and Instagram. In addition to beating the women and underage girls she recruited into her stable, described one news report, the defendant also forced the victim to get Melanie tattooed on her face, confiscated her belongings and identity documents, and continually threatened to kill the victim if she tried to leave. Where had Melanie learned such behavior? According to her attorney, through her own past as a victim of human trafficking and what she was exposed to as a child. In a 2014 study of interviews of 73 traffickers and pimps by the Urban Institute, nearly 1/3 reported being influenced by people they grew up with or the neighborhood they grew up in. The Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act and Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Acts were both passed in 2018, despite sex worker outcry and protest. Shortly before, the popular site for consensual workers and traffickers alike, Backpage, was shut down. So what impact has FOSTA/SESTA had? An analysis by the Washington Post found that the amount of sex trafficking ads had rebounded to 75% of the original amount within 4 months of FOSTA/SESTA's passage. Back when the Justice Department was questioning if FOSTA/SESTA was necessary, their 2016 study concluded that the total number of juveniles in the sex trade in the United States was about 9,000 to 10,000. The study also found that only about 15% of the children relied on pimps, and that the average age of entry into the sex trade was 15.8 years. Fast forward to after FOSTA/SESTA passed. Documented Amelia Galley. In San Francisco, crimes related to pimping and street-based transactions have more than tripled. According to Pike Long, the deputy director of St. James Infirmary, a health and safety clinic for sex workers in San Francisco, sex workers have reported that former pimps came out of the woodwork, offering to manage their businesses again since they were now rendered unable to find and screen clients online. In New York City, data from the same year shows a 180% increase in arrests for loitering for prostitution after years of continuous decline in such arrests. The Hacking/Hustling Collective, founded by Ariel Wolf and Danielle Blunt, studied 110 consensual sex workers in the aftermath of FOSTA/SESTA. They found that several returned to street-based survival sex work and/or pimps, putting them in greater danger. Also, most importantly, that 50% of the sample group had barriers to other forms of labor because of mental health diagnoses, chronic illness, and disability. This is a reminder to those who abhor sex work, and I know it's a lot of you, that ableism in the workforce, as well as medical debt and poverty, are bigger enemies than the consensual sex workers you seek to save or denigrate. A 2022 report on sex trafficking found that the number of persons prosecuted for human trafficking increased from 729 in 2011 to 1343 in 2020. The number of persons convicted of a federal human trafficking offense increased from 464 people in 2011 to 837 in 2019, before falling in 2020 to just 658. Of the 1,169 defendants charged in U.S. District Court with human trafficking offenses in fiscal year 2020, 92% were male, 63% were white, 18% were black, and 17% were Hispanic. 66% had no prior convictions. The report didn't say how many of these traffickers were law enforcement, but sporadic reports from the past decade have continuously exposed police officers for being involved with trafficking rings or covering them up. But news reports also obscure important details for people who don't read past headlines. For instance, when sting operations on the sex trade happen, consensual workers are often swept up in the huge numbers. In 2022, a Polk County, Florida deputy police chief was busted along with 160 other people. Of those, only 2 were determined to be sex trafficking victims. Over half were people offering to commit prostitution, aka survival sex workers. As I said in the intro of this video, with these stigmatizing charges and the trauma and harm that comes from jail, employment elsewhere becomes more and more unlikely with each arrest, and a return to survival sex work and/or pimping becomes more and more likely. As many of you who watch this channel know, I believe sex work should be decriminalized, but I don't expect most of my viewers, and especially not America, to agree. Nor do I agree with more radical assessments that sex work is automatically empowering or feminist. There are legitimate grievances in sex work when you use an intersectional and analytical lens that accounts for power dynamics and capitalism, like in any other industry. But the victims of pimps and sex trafficking should not and cannot be ignored. In fact, their stories, often repeating the same origins, abuse, abandonment, law enforcement failure, poor self-esteem, etc., indict humanity on a historical scale that begs examination. This is what I explain when I meet people where they are, instead of expecting them to shed centuries of whorephobia, religious principles, and misogyny overnight. Nobody's gonna do that. They ask me, what will mitigate pimping and/or sex trafficking? If you have a special hate for sex work more than any other type of labor, you must demand what can be done to make sex work less prevalent. And baby, like most of our political landscape, it's a multi-headed beast that requires multiple solutions associated with pretty much every other problem. Many of them I talk about on this channel. But let me break it down for you. If you hate sex work, you should agree with most, if not all, of these bullet points. This may sound controversial, but high school students should be aware of what pimping is and how it works psychologically. I think not knowing puts a bunch of youth at risk. The sexual abuse of black children, but particularly for this topic, the sexual abuse of black boys, must be given much more attention. Survivors of child sexual abuse need therapy and help, and grown people who groom children need jail and to be never let out. You cannot rehabilitate a sexual abuser. I don't give a fuck. Argue with your mama, argue with people in the comments, but don't argue with me because you're not changing my mind. Anyways, also, next, Misogyny must be eradicated. The myriad of ways that girls are made to feel inadequate or incomplete will continuously provide fresh victims with low self-esteem. Patriarchy. Because of the cultural and social importance placed on father-daughter relationships, along with it being a pretty big biological deal, like you can't help it, one person is your daddy, one person is your mama, like they a part of you, you're gonna have, little psychological issues over that if one of them happens to be missing. So the presence and unconditional and non-violent, non-abusive love of fathers is important. And again, that's not changing anytime soon. The affirmation of girls whose fathers have left them must also be a priority, which means you can't sit and laugh and joke about black girls as fatherless and also claim to care about their well-being. Like, you can't. Next, there must be an end to poverty, an end to homelessness, and healthcare must be freely accessible, because your personal objection to the labor of sex work will not pay anybody's bills or medical emergencies, nor will it take care of any of their dependents. In addition to all of the above, which means erasing religious tenets and obliterating long-held cultural and racial beliefs that make exploitation possible, violent and mentally abusive pimps and traffickers must face longer prison sentences, receive harm reduction programs while inside, and be held accountable. Whatever the fuck that means. To me, being held accountable means sitting your ass in a cell for the rest of your life. Because if you were trafficking children, trafficking women, I don't really think you can be reformed, but there are people who argue that. But also, it requires a fundamental rewiring of how we view billionaires and other titans of industry, who are similarly praised for exploiting, gaming, or pimping a system for massive wealth, regardless of whom they hurt in the process. Think of all the people sucking Elon Musk's dick. Think about the way Diddy was celebrated and championed for over 2 decades because of his tenacious business acumen, while being an awful band manager, making people hike for cheesecake, etc., while his sexual perversions were hidden away. And lastly, it requires us to ask who is truly benefiting from or who should be entertained by the pimp aesthetic. Now I leave you with questions. Earlier, I mentioned a divergence of the pimp as occupation from the pimp aesthetic, mindset, and colloquialisms. Should we divest from the pimp aesthetic and those colloquialisms? Is the pimp mindset here to stay so long as capitalism and exploitation is? Coincidentally, we've reached the broader point of this video. Why American society, particularly those in hip-hop, have upheld pimps. Why wouldn't they? If the country itself is built on a system of exploitation and does everything to keep that system alive. And even broader, if the world is built on systems of exploitation. I'm talking world history, baby, not just this little teeny bit of scope of American history. Again, why wouldn't the pimp be of interest, achieving legendary status, for better or for worse? Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something new. Be sure to leave a comment and subscribe, and for sources and more, check out the link to my Patreon below.